Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back in to talk about my thoughts for the Amirdrassil raid as we have finally killed Mythic Amirdrassil, and with the conclusion of this tier and the conclusion of really all the raid tiers of Dragonflight, I just wanted to give my thoughts on how the raid was from a healer perspective, and also just, some of my own history from raiding. For those who don't know, I've gotten every cutting edge since basically Siege of Orgrimmar. I've been playing like non-stop since then, never taken any breaks. Seen all the high end from raiding 12, 14 hours a day, finishing as high as World 13th, to the guild I'm in now, where I think we finished around World 40, World 50, or something along those lines. And Amirdrassil was the most interesting raid and the best raid of Dragonflight by a large margin. Part of that definitely relates to how much better it feels when the spec you like playing is good and fun to play. Going into the start of Dragonflight, playing Disc in like Vault of the Incarnates, there were some fine bosses. There's, like Taros, it was pretty fun. And then there's also just nightmare bosses like, gosh, what was the Windstorm boss called? You guys probably know what it is. But yeah, that was just horrifying to be playing. And being able to actually get a couple boss fights in, especially with all the reworks and seeing how much change Disc has had, I really enjoy the game a lot more, especially when the spec that I like playing is at its peak. And when we're always in this like bottom chasing zone, or you kind of like take for granted that like Disc is going to be good in raids like it has been for the past like 8 years, it's really noticeable when it's not. It's really, really noticeable. And so thankfully Disc was popping off in Amirdrassil, and it was incredibly fun to play. And also I was very satisfied by a number of like the early boss fights and some of like the steadier progression that you had, but it very quickly came into almost like stomping through some of the boss fights a little bit too quickly. One of the most fun things to me about Mythic raiding is the little nuance that exists for high-end raiding when pre-nerf to a boss or pre-like heavy nerf to a boss. You're able to see these like interesting little like intricacies in terms of how you play or how the boss is going to maneuver and how you counter it and how you play around it. And I felt like when progressing throughout this raid that we kind of missed that on fights like Laradar, where it almost like died too quickly. And even a bit with fights like Nimue as well, I kind of felt it there, where it's like, oh, like we're really getting into like the nitty gritty and how we like min-max our damage out, and the boss is just dead, and naturally as you get more gear, okay, the boss just sort of fell over. And that felt fine, and Smolderon was extremely fun to play, partially because of that little bit of nuance that existed in how you position yourself, how you dodge lines, how you prep your healing. But then the difficulty curve is where you just sort of like hit a brick wall going into Tindral and Farak. Now, I actually think I enjoyed Tindral the most out of this raid. I think that was actually my favorite fight before... no, Smolderon was definitely my favorite fight, sorry. But Tindral was actually my like second or third favorite, and certainly it was more fun than Farak, because I think a lot of those like little intricacies in both how you use your defensives and prep for the incoming damage, also how you prep your output, your movement, but also one of the things that WoW does the best for like raiding in general is the dynamic nature, the dynamism, I think, citation needed, of the game, where you have to think on your feet and you actually have to go solve those problems, and it's not so scripted the way that like Final Fantasy raiding is. And while I like Final Fantasy raiding, and I've done it a couple times on Savage, it also doesn't really have that dynamic nature to it of, oh, I have to think on my feet, or I have to like work with my teammates to be able to solve how we're going to do the seeds. Here's the zone defense, or at least it hasn't for the raiding that I've done with it. Don't hate me, Final Fantasy fans. But I digress. Tindral, absolutely super fun. Even having, I don't know, some 400 wipes or whatever that my guild had, it didn't really feel like it was that bad, because a lot of them were like phase 1 wipes, where phase 1 lasted a minute and a half or something. And so it was like, oh, well, quick wipe, reboot and go again. It was very different than most seasons that I've experienced, where you could dump 400 wipes into a boss and it would take like 2 to 4 days, 3 or 4 days maybe. And it was like, oh, well, like that's life. Who cares? And it didn't actually feel like it was some like crazy grading thing, as opposed to like Sanctum of Domination, where going into Painsmith or going to Sylvanas Prog, it was just hundreds and hundreds of attempts that just drained the life out of you. And well, there's some pretty fun fights in there, particularly Painsmith, and the satisfaction of being able to kill those bosses. You also just, again, had longer wipes, and that could really drain your mental. And that's something throughout really all of raiding that I've noticed being probably one of like the biggest factors for both my enjoyment of the game and for like raid success, has been the personalities of people you play with, the environment that you sort of surround yourself with, and how well they're going to be able to deal with stressful situations. Because when I rejoined Incarnate, that was one of the biggest reasons that I went back there, was because of the environment, because there were raiders that I'd known 5-6 years ago back in Legion, however long ago it was, they were still raiding, still playing the game, still building a community and maintaining it. And that says a lot about those people, and it says a lot about that team, that they're still rating in the top 10, top 15-ish for US, top 50 something in the world, still putting up good ranks, and still maintaining a community that's doing sales runs together, watching TV shows together. And that didn't really disappoint at all as well when I rejoined. And it's nice to be able to be in that environment where you can have like the friendships. Of course, it's 20 something people. You're going to, have banter, and you're going to have moments you get frustrated with other people, but not having those moments that I've had in like really high end rating where everybody's sole goal is the progression and the stress of the ranks and the stress of the hours and the stress of the boss fight and the performance of other people. It really adds up, and it affects your mental, and it affects your own gameplay. It affects your enjoyment of the game really as well. And so I think while we didn't hit like the ranking that we wanted to, while we didn't hit our like best possible ranking, which I think we could have with this raid, we had the opportunity to, just didn't pan out. I honestly don't feel too bad about those things, because I've kind of moved on past like stressing so much about the ranks. I think it's more important that we like play to our potential as a team, which, like I said, we kind of didn't, and it was more of like a low disappointment rather than other raid tiers I've had where I rated in Future, I rated in Imperative, where it was like, gosh, we missed this mark. This really sucks for us. This is really bad. We really have to focus on it. And I don't know, maybe it's just that as time changes, right? Start thinking about those things differently. But Farak, and I know I haven't really talked enough about it here, the reasons why Farak was sort of frustrating as well, part of it was definitely due to like playing 1 minute Shadow Fiend, which I was not a huge fan of playing for that fight. Trying to make sure you're stacking like 45 something % haste to be able to mash smite, to be able to get Shadow Fiends, to be able to carry certain phases of the fight. It's valuable, it's great, it's high performing, don't get me wrong, but it's also undeniably frustrating when you start seeing your allies taking damage. This is something I've talked about in my previous like coaching session video. We're like, oh yeah, this isn't your responsibility, you're gonna be fine. But at least when you play Mindbender as a setup, you're like, I eventually will go back to that, but there's just like these big gaps when playing a Shadow Fiend setup where you're just like, good luck, have fun. I'm gonna keep on smiting, and that's about it. And having really such like small amounts of rot damage occurring both on Farak and honestly like most of the raid really disappointed me. And I was expecting more, and I was hoping for more, especially when, like I said, 6 or 8 of the bosses all had rot mechanics onto them where they deal consistent taking damage for long periods of time. All those rot mechanics were like 3k here, 5k there, woo, and eventually it would add up to a large amount of damage, but the burst was still insanely high. And I felt like that was really noticeable as well on Farak, where you're having to deal with just the wombo combos of some of like the traps that players need to get broken out of, while healers are trying to focus their attention on ad healing. Then you're having these moments where players are getting like 100 to 0'd in like 2 seconds, and you have to make sure that you have somebody around to babysit them. It's a weird sort of setup that they had in the raid fight that I was not a huge fan of, but I will say the final phase was extremely satisfying and kind of like exactly what I hoped for. It was more so like phase 1, phase 2, where there could just be like insane burst damage out of nowhere that shocks people and surprises people, or having like ads and random errant blaze lines hitting ads just completely ruining your strategy in a heartbeat. Those kind of things are pretty frustrating to play around. I honestly kind of hope they don't go this hardcore with ad healing, especially single target ad healing in future raid fights, because that felt more like a chore than like you were helping the raid team. Kind of get why they did it, and I'm glad that they experiment with these things, but definitely wasn't my favorite throughout. But overall, my plans going forward, keep on raiding, obviously with my team, probably start gearing up my monk some more, maybe a 3rd character. I don't know if it's going to be Paladin, because Paladin's certainly not the sauce at the moment, or not feeling fun at the moment, I should say. And of course, getting more focused on pushing on to IO, and continuing on with our coaching videos, our roundtable videos, and the War Within coverage. So make sure you keep it here and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you guys are thinking about Amirdrassil and your experiences thus far. Let me know what you guys liked, didn't like, all that kind of stuff about it, and I'll catch y'all next time.